When is a knife a sword? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms as well. And now I've been asked a really interesting question. I got through to the channel email address from Matthias, or Matthias, however you pronounce your name. So thank you for your question. I don't know your surname, and obviously I would give that if I knew it, but I don't know it from the email. And the basic question is, Matt, I'm confused. Often I see large knives described as knives, but not as swords. And sometimes I see things that I think are swords described as knives. What's up with that? So this is a really great question. And actually, Matthias is not the first person that has asked me this. I've been asked this a lot over the years. And I've sort of touched on this, I think years and years ago, I kind of touched on this topic in a video. And the basic answer is there is no easy answer. Sometimes there are weapons which you could refer to as a knife and you could refer to as a sword. So in my left hand here, I have a Khyber knife, commonly referred to as a Khyber knife. Traditionally, actually where it's from, it's known as a chola or chara. And it's this type of knife from Afghanistan and was used a lot in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century as well. And this is fairly large, but it does kind of look like a knife, doesn't it? And it's one of those things you can imagine if someone's trying to describe this weapon, it looks a bit like a giant carving knife. Now, it's not. It has a T-section blade and it's got a very specific design, but from a layperson's point of view, or even from a British soldier who's campaigning out in Afghanistan in 1880, they would describe that as a knife because it looks like a big old knife. But some people might describe it as a sword because of its size, and that's fine. It can be both. Now, an interesting thing is, in contrast, we pick up, this is a replica Bronze Age Ewart Park style sword by Neil Burridge. And partially by me as well. I made it on one of his sword making courses. And yes, it doesn't have a hilt fitted yet, which I've never got around to doing. But this type of Bronze Age sword, we absolutely refer to that as a sword. I don't think many people would describe this as a knife. And yet, you put these things side by side, and actually the Khyber knife is bigger than the sword. So size isn't necessarily the defining factor, but it kind of can be. So in one case, most people would call that a knife, and in that case, pretty much everyone would call that a sword, and yet actually the sword is smaller than the knife. So what's up with that? Well, I think there are a couple of other factors to consider here. Number one is the construction method. Number two is the style. And number three is the method of use. So let's break those things down. So the construction method. Now the Khyber knife, if I pick up a different weapon here quickly, the famous medieval European Langmesser. Now the Langmesser is bigger than the Khyber knife. In general, you do actually get really big versions of these, and you do get quite small versions of these. But you will notice that both of them share something in common, and that is the fact that they're both constructed like knives often are. And as many of you will know, the messer means knife. So when we refer to it, the messer, it's actually very nondescript and kind of incorrect in a way, in that messer just means knife. We're just calling this a knife. However, period sources often refer to these as knives, but they also refer to them as swords. So something can be a knife and a sword, and hence the name Langsmesser, so long knife, or Grossmesser, big knife. These kind of names. Now, why did they call it a knife? Well, the prevailing theory is that is because they're constructed and styled like a big knife. So period knives, the Baumwehr, for example, and Rugger were constructed in the same way as this. So whilst it has the proportions and size of a short-ish sword, it has a hilt construction that's basically like a knife. Okay, so that's part of it, is the construction method, and that also connects into the style. So something can not only be constructed sort of like a knife, but just overall have the look of the knife, and that's where we come back to the Khyber knife, because it looks like most people's perception of a knife. Whereas the Bronze Age Ewart Park style sword doesn't look like most people's idea of a knife. If anything, it could be like a giant dagger. It looks a bit like Sting from Lord of the Rings. So you could call it a short sword, but it has the style of a sword. Okay, so construction method and construction style, and I think part of that is also to do with handguards, although not always. Very often the addition of a handguard or a certain style of hilt, again we come back to style, makes something look more like a sword than a knife. Okay, but once again, size can be a confusing thing. So I pick up this, which is probably Mexican or maybe South American machete-like fighting knife, and it's like a giant bowie knife, but it's pretty damned big, isn't it? I mean, it's practically a messer, and it's bigger than something you might call a knife. But this is when we come into the final point that I listed, method of use. Okay, so if you have a weapon that is designed to be predominantly used as a tool or as a thing that you wear on your belt, then probably that's more likely to be classed as a knife, assuming that it's small enough to be classed as a knife or a machete. Whereas if something is relatively large sized, like this Bronze Age sword again, but it's designed to be used with a shield in combat, you're more likely to call it a sword. And that's where coming back to the Kyber knife, is kind of problematic, because it's not a tool. It's absolutely not a tool. It is very much a dedicated weapon. Unlike the kukri, which was used as a tool and a weapon, this was pretty much only a weapon. Okay, they had utilitarian knives for tools. These were weapons. So why not call it a sword? Well, again, I think it just comes back to the styling and the construction. This one is problematic. What do we call this? Is it a giant knife? Is it a short sword? I don't know. I think you can call it either. It's a matter of opinion. I think the addition of a guard makes it look more sword-like, especially as it's a sword-ish guard. It's not even a small knife guard. But the method of construction is almost exactly the same as a machete. If you put the guard aside, the cross-section of the blade, the style of the grip and hilt construction. So it's kind of a fighting machete, if anything. So is that a knife and a sword? Is that a knife or a sword? Yes, it's whichever one you want to call it. Now, coming back again to the Kyber knife, so this was used very much in the same area and in the same period as the tulwar and the pulwar. This is a tulwar, incidentally. They differ only in the pommel style, and actually in linguistically, pulwar just means the same thing as tulwar, and they both just mean sword. But this was called a sword and this was called a knife. They were different things. So this was, generally speaking, both in the native languages and in English, this was referred to as a knife and this was referred to as a sword. And yes, in this case, there is a size difference. But you do get short tulwars and you do get really massive Kyber knives. And I think, again, it comes down to the styling. One looks more like a knife, one looks more like a sword. This has got a crossguard and a knuckle bow and a pommel. This one has got a kind of a knife hilt. Finally, we get into to bring another ethnographic example in, we get into the world of Chinese swords for another cross-reference point here. And this type of dao, the dao seems to be almost similar to the European messer, not only in terms of what it looks like, but also how it occupies the language as well. So the jian, the straight double-edged sword, seems to be considered a sword, whereas the dao seems to be considered a big knife or langmesser. So very similar space, and the relationship between this and knives seems to be acknowledged not only in the culture but also in the language as well. Obviously those things are tied together strongly. So this is almost like a big knife as opposed to a sword, which in many cases is double-edged, but doesn't have to be, of course. You know, back swords aren't double-edged, sabres aren't double-edged, but they are considered as swords. But certainly in the case of the sabre probably has a close relationship with the langmesser as well as other types of sword, which are sword. So, to conclude, fundamentally, what you decide to call a knife and what you decide to call a sword is subjective. However, there are certain types of sword which basically would never get described as a knife. And there are certain types of knives which would never get described as a sword. But there are a significant number of types of sword and knife from around the world, from different cultures, whether it's Afghanistan or India or China or medieval Europe, that could be described as a sword or could be described as a big knife. And there are some that we don't really know what to call them, like this Latin American thing here, which I don't really know what to call it. A really big knife, I think, is what I'd call it. But you could call it a machete, you could call it a short sword. It's up to you. I hope that's useful and instructive. Give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you really soon again on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.